So I'm just going to quickly whiz through this in the interest of time and aware that we're running over schedule. So just following on from what Joe said, I've just one of the small bits of work that I've done in this term is to look at creating a standardised orientation package for locum medical officers. So just a quick show of hands, how many people in here work in departments which use locum medical officers? And how many of you work in departments where there might only be one medical practitioner sometimes? So, fine, okay. So this arose from a sort of patient safety initiative as identified by some of our rural site visits through the ECI, from eQuest, from some of the RCA data, and from a bit of a literature review looking at adverse events. There was a big body of work done in 2005 undertaken by Locum Issues workforce, which identified that there were issues about locum medical officers, including their use, experience, the growth, and the kind of future challenges. And this led to some subsequent guidelines and legislation around pre-employment checks, referees, a standardised skills set list. But despite this work, the use of locum medical officers is recurrently identified as a challenge and faced by EDs, particularly by smaller, more rural departments. Many of whom rely on locum medical officer for a significant proportion of their cover, especially out-of-hours cover. The orientation process for these doctors is really variable and sadly often doesn't exist at all. This project didn't look at sort of aiming to address medical error or the skills limitations of the individuals, but was just trying to identify what the perceived barriers to working as a locum or working with locums in these environments are, and to see if there are any tools or that we can provide from the ECI that can really help provide the doctors with the information they require, as particularly focusing at local resources, how to escalate in a crisis, or sort of local procedures and policies. So the aim was to produce a standardised pro forma kind of document which could be used in all EDs. We recognise that many emergency departments do have orientation processes in place, so it's not trying to reinvent the wheel. But I suppose it's trying to plug a gap where there is one. We targeted the smaller, more isolated departments because they have the additional challenge of less staff on the ground, so less people to phone, less friends to phone for help. The aim is it's a blank document which has space for all the essential information, but it's always in a kind of structured format, so someone just needs to spend a couple of hours and fill in the relevant information for their department. It's similar to having the kind of standardised formats for handover. We now use SBAR and MIST. We have a structure for handing over critical pieces of information that the important stuff isn't missed, and so that everyone receives it, hears it, asks for it in the same manner. This is now really standard practice. So why just shouldn't we have this when you're starting in a new facility? We know it's a high-risk time, clinical handover. So I wrote to all the ECI contacts that we had on our contacts list in all the level 1 to 3 EDs and invited them to send the survey and information on to any interested parties, clinical or non-clinical. Trying to also get some feedback from the doctors who are working in these departments, and locums are notoriously hard to kind of track down, so thought, well, we'll write to the locum agencies and get them to forward it on to their people that they have listed as working in emergency departments to see if they can kind of get some engagement and feedback. And it was a letter of introduction, explanation of what the project was, with a quick link to a survey requesting feedback. So the results that we didn't get a huge feedback from medical officers. I think we got about 20 people who actually responded, so a very tiny proportion, and don't know how many were actually sent on. About half of the 37 locum agencies responded and said they'd sent it on, but we don't know what kind of reach that had. But generally they were a fairly experienced cohort, mostly PGY 5 experience. About 70% had worked in at least 2 different departments over the past 3 months. They were half and half. Some were specialists in a college, and the other half had no specialist qualifications, and about half had a regular contracted job, and the other half were permanent locums. They just reported that 60% of them said they'd never received any orientation in the last department that they worked at. And of those that did, the 40% that did, they got some of it was emails, some of it was online modules, sometimes it was a document, sometimes it was a walk around. It was really disparate and very kind of disjointed how that orientation was delivered. I asked them whether they had ever had a situation where they required extra assistance when they were working as a locum. And again, about 60% of them identified that they had times when they needed extra assistance, and about 2/3 of that time again they said that there was difficulty in accessing that assistance when required, and the issues most commonly identified were didn't know who to call, didn't know how to transfer the patient, couldn't access the computer, didn't know how to escalate. I also asked them about adverse patient events that they knew about to their knowledge. About 30% said they'd had an adverse patient event when working as a locum. And the issues identified there were every department is different, handover processes, don't know who to call, unfamiliar with the policies and the protocols and the local resources available. The hospital contacts that we sent to got a really fantastic response. I think it was about 80 people responded, mostly nursing staff, because these departments are heavily staffed by experienced nurses, some with extended scope of practice. But also some medical officers, administrators, and some physiotherapists as well. They were generally a very experienced cohort who'd been in their position for at least 5 years, and they reflected what the doctors had told us. About 60% said, yeah, we don't have an orientation process, or I don't know if we have one or not. We asked the contacts at the hospital to identify what they found most challenging about working with medical officers. And as you can see from the slide, the overwhelming kind of feedback was, again, not their clinical knowledge. It was lack of understanding of the local processes, protocols, the logistical challenges, or the geography. It sounds obvious, but it's all the stuff that I would hope would have been included or could be potentially addressed by effective orientation to a department. I asked them all for what pieces of wisdom, what do they want doctors or locums to know when they come to their department? What do they expect from them, and what would they want included in some kind of orientation manual? The orientation per se was identified as an issue in a small percent, but nearly 14% identified a lack of knowledge of departmental processes and protocols, knowing what services are available, how to find protocols and policies. So both sides are agreeing that this is an issue. They both identify the same gaps in their knowledge. And I think that most of this stuff could be addressed by having a clear orientation process. So I've collated the responses into kind of feedback categories, created a pro forma document, so 24-hour ways to access help, what you have in your department, how you refer, where you refer to, in a sort of standardised, I think, a 6-page document. And all that's then required is someone to go through and fill in the blanks, fill in the gaps. And some of it might not be applicable to that department. Fine, you can just leave it out. But it means that every time you start in a new place, you know exactly where to find it. You can find it in a hurry. You can find it in a stress. You can find it in the middle of the night because you know, oh yeah, on page 3, that process. It's not a 50-page document that you're never going to read or get sent to you in the post. Hopefully, the critical information should all be there. It's going to be available, hopefully, in paper and electronic versions for those that want it in the smaller departments. And myself or one of my colleagues will look for some feedback on it in the first month and then 6 months after use from both, again, the doctors and departments. Does it work? Are there gaps? Is it useless? Do we need to change it? And it'll be available on the ECI website to print out. Again, it's mostly targeted at the smaller departments, but there may be a role for it in some of the larger district hospitals too. Thank you.